Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are in the world. I am Sephirosa Carroll, Program Executive for Mission from the Margins and the Ecumenical Indigenous Peoples Network with the World Council of Churches. Before we start this session, please allow me a few seconds to share some brief technical notes. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on the World Council of Churches YouTube channel. Secondly, during this session, we are very happy to gather your questions for the Q&A session. So please use the Q&A function to ask your questions of the speakers. In case of need for technical support, please reach out in writing to WCC CWM Technical Support Team via the Zoom chat box. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this morning's session, the Reverend Dr. Philip Vinod Peacock. Philip is an ordained minister in the Church of North India, and he currently serves as the Executive Secretary for Justice and Witness for the World Communion of Reformed Churches. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you so much, Steph, and welcome to everyone to this webinar. This is the third in a series of 4 webinars that we are doing on anti-racist in Christ. In our webinar yesterday, we began with a missionary image or representation of Christ, and then moved to look at how is Christ represented, and even further to what Christ represents for us. There was a common understanding that images of a white Jesus were pervasive in all our cultures, and that each culture, although they may have found this image offensive, also were able to through their own agency and through their own means to appropriate these images in different ways. The webinar yesterday accepted the reluctance and hesitation of the role of the church and mission agencies in this white missionary expansion project, and recognized that the desire for repair was still far-fetched, particularly in areas which continue to be colonized. And this was particularly true of the Palestinian question. We also recognize that colonialism had a variety of avatars, and it manifested itself in so many different ways. Today, we are going to be looking at models of how we can perhaps look at this question of anti-racism in Christ in a different way. We will look at models that the church is involved with, and we will look at models in which racism that exists among and between minority ethnic groups, and how perhaps this can be addressed. And to do this, we have an awesome, I would say, group of panelists, of speakers who are joining us today. The first among them is the Reverend James Bhagwan, the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches and ordained minister of the Methodist Church in Fiji. He is passionate in his work on climate justice, with particular emphasis on the ocean, gender equality, self-determination, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue. Our second panelist is the Reverend Dr. Fernando Enns, Professor for Peace, Theology, and Ethics at the Free University Amsterdam and Director of the Amsterdam Center for Religion and Peace and Justice Studies. Dr. Fernando comes with a long history of involvement with the ecumenical movement and is presently co-moderator of the International Reference Group of the Ecumenical Pilgrimage for Justice and Peace. Our third panelist for today is the Reverend Dr. Lesmore Gibson Ezekiel. He currently serves as the Director of Programs at the All Africa Conference of Churches and previously served as Director for Peace, Diaconia and Development at AACC. He also brings with him a long history of ecumenical involvement and is passionate in the naming and shaming of legacies of slavery and exploring transformative ecumenism. Our fourth panelist, for today is Ms. Priyanka Sami, and she is an intersectional feminist associated with the National Federation of Dalit Women. The NFDW is a pan-Indian network of Dalit women, and her work experience over the years has focused on strengthening governance ecosystems at various levels. A very, very warm welcome to these panelists and an extremely warm welcome to all of you who are attending from different parts of the world. This is not intended to be a one-way lecture. Rather, what we are trying to do is engage our panelists and our participants in a conversation. And so while we move through this entire webinar, may I remind you, as Seth already has, that you ask your questions or make your comments in the Q&A box, which is found at the bottom of your screen. We now enter into our first question, in which we will be asking our panelists really to look and reflect on an image that we will now be putting up. And Dr. Enns, I would like to begin by asking you this question. Considering the image that you're looking at, what demonstrations of power have you witnessed in your long work against racism and colonial violence?
Thank you very much, Dr. Peacock. It's great to be here, and it's a pleasure to be invited to this distinguished panel. When I look at that image, I mean, I'm immediately reminded of demonstrations that we had last year after the killing of George Floyd, which was really a shock to many people. And finally, this movement of Black Lives Matter reached Europe. All of a sudden, it was, for some of us, it was surprising to see that, but nevertheless, it was outstanding to see demonstrations in Amsterdam, where I'm sitting now in the Netherlands, but also in Germany, in Hamburg, my other university where I'm teaching. All of a sudden, my students, young students, very young students, decided to walk the streets, carrying their pictures and the material that says Black Lives Matter. We had not seen that before, I must say. I mean, we knew, some of us knew that this is going on, especially in North America. But here, for the first time, it was like in Western European cities, young people, old people, middle-aged people, everyone was out there on the streets. So I think this was a very powerful demonstration indeed. Yet one has to ask the question, is this a sustainable movement? Was this just because, you know, George Floyd was on every screen, it was displayed on all the media, and it was shocking, and everybody had seen this 9.5-minute video of killing, and hearing the sound of a person who says, "I can't breathe," crying out for his mother, and still the police would not back up. I think this image is a symbol of brutality. It is a symbol of governmental violence, and it is a symbol of racism, and it was so bluntly. And I think this has caused a lot of reactions also in Europe, in Western Europe. Yet I'm a bit cautious, as I'm saying. This is we will have to see how that is really materializing. Not only in looking to North America and say like, oh, look how bad it is there, But is this, and this is my question, is this really leading to something that is looking at ourselves, in our own societies, and to discover how much racism is present here? So I'm very happy with this wake-up call, let's say, and to see that churches, governments, politicians, civil society has been called and is waking up. But we will have to see how that is continuing and how that really moves into a change, a real transformation in the societies.
Thank you, Dr. Enns. I think you've raised a very important question, that the moment generated a certain kind of energy. But is this energy actually sustainable into the future, and what can we do with it? Ms. Priyanka, the slogans of Black Lives Matter, I Can't Breathe, resonated across the world, and definitely we know it had its resonance in India, particularly with the Dalit Lives Matter. From your experience of working with the Dalit movements in India, how would you reflect on this image, and what demonstrations of power have you witnessed in your work?
Thank you. You know, the image reminds me of the various demonstrations we Dalits have organized over the years, I would say over decades, to highlight the fact that Dalit lives matter. You know, for those of you who might not be familiar with caste, I'll briefly speak to that. India's caste system is the world's longest surviving social hierarchy. The practice of caste is widely pervasive, not only in the Indian subcontinent, but across the globe through the South Asian diaspora. Therefore, it's a global issue. Both the practices of racism and casteism operate on the premise of purity and exclusion. You know, we Dalits have been long arguing that caste is a basis of discrimination on par with racism and apartheid. Parallels have been drawn of the similar struggles between of the Blacks and the Dalits, and the need to decolonize these social constructs. So over years of engaging from the grassroots to the global level, Dalits have really helped unravel wider conversations around oppression and discrimination. However, our struggles continue as the practice of caste-based discrimination continues unabated in all walks of lives, as well as within our churches across South Asia. Therefore, you know, we Dalits have really been advocating with our governments, with our churches, both at the national level as well as globally, to recognize caste as a global issue and use the term caste in all their official documents, along with race, ethnicity, gender, among others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. I think that was a very, very important part, to speak of these 300 million and more people who every day suffer these various forms of discrimination, and connect it in this way to the Black Lives Matter movement. I would like to move on to Les More now. And from your experience of working with the African Council of Churches, with the African experience, how do you respond to Black Lives Matter, that particular image, which actually calls for this alliance building among minority groups?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, friends. Indeed, when I viewed the image, it evoked in me, of course, the need for global solidarity. However, you would find the ambivalence, where here you see young people, Koreans, who are saying Black Lives Matter. Of course, it is a global solidarity because humanity is involved, not on the basis of race, but humanity. And as religious people, we do recognize that we embody the image of God, regardless of the kind of race you belong to. And here we see Koreans in this global solidarity for Black Lives Matter. Ordinarily, you wouldn't have expected them to take such costly risk when you see that this toxic form of militancy made visible even by the presence of the police that were there. Now, after the global outcry, when George Floyd was assassinated, was killed, brutally murdered, we expected that the police would have changed, would have been transformed. But yet after that, how many were slaughtered, murdered by these same forces? So it raises the question of, do the government, this empiric power, listen to the outcry, the voice of the people who recognize our common humanity, regardless of our racial identity? Here are young people demonstrating, and yet you find the police who claim to protect. And yet, if it gets to a point, this same police that is empowered to protect citizens who have constitutional rights to protest, they will go after them. They will go after them. And you ask the question, where is their humanity? Why do we really need the police? Why do we need such structures and systems that have continued to nurture, preserve, and sustain this brutal force against humanity? These are the experiences we go through in Africa. But how long shall we continue to make reference to, yes, these are vestiges of colonialism? When shall we move on and say, yes, like what has happened in South Africa? The anti-apartheid movement, which led to the demolition of the apartheid regime. But yet, do we see such kind of transformation in contexts like America, where there was an outcry concerning anti-racial brutality, exclusion, violence, and all kinds of things that are meted to those who look differently from the whites? And sadly, you would always find, and you will never find probably, a white person who would say, I am a racist, and therefore I repent, I am born again. So it evokes, of course, the question of global solidarity and the effect such solidarity will always have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Les More. I think you brought to the foreground the very important question that this is a justice issue for all. It's not just the work of a particular identity group. And so thank you very, very much for that. I move now to the Reverend James Bhagwan. And Reverend James, I mean, we know that because of the legacies of colonialism, racism is a problem even in the Pacific now. How would you reflect on this particular image? And what do you think we should say or do about it, actually?
Thank you, Philip. Before I respond, may I just quickly acknowledge that in the Pacific today is We Bleed Black and Red Wednesday. Across the Pacific, we wear black and red in solidarity of our sisters and brothers in West Papua, continuing to suffer from oppression and colonization from Indonesia. And the Pacific churches have been quite strong in advocating for the self-determination of the people of West Papua. And I acknowledge Dr. Francine on on Monday in this same webinar series, and she's with us today. I also want to acknowledge the memory of the late Pastor Alan Nafuki, who is the who wasn't at the time of his death the assembly clerk of the Presbyterian Church in Vanuatu, a very strong fighter for indigenous rights and independence and self-determination, not just for West Papua, but across the Pacific, where we still have a number of colonies. This picture is quite interesting because I lived in Korea for a couple of years. You know, 8 years when I was 8 years ago when I was there, I wouldn't have seen this type of engagement. We were, those of us of dark skin were actually seen as quite strange people. And that's to be understood in a predominantly homogenized, closed society. But we see from this picture the impact of American culture, and also the cultural homogenization that has been part of globalization, particularly through social media. And so I'd like to share, if possible, I don't know if that's come out. Let me see if that's, maybe that's the wrong.
Yes, it has. There is an image.
You can see the picture? Okay, this is
Yes,
the result of the Black Lives Matter movement when it came to the Pacific. Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter was also echoed as West Papuan Lives Matter. And here you see both in other parts of the Pacific and other areas, people taking up the cause of West Papua, and the West Papuan people themselves trying to address both the overt racism that one sees as a result of this, where in 2019 there were riots around the abuse of West Papuan students and communities being called monkeys. And so this is a response to that, but also to the structural racism, which continues in the way in which they are not only treated culturally and socially, but politically, economically, and you know, even environmentally. So for me, this echoes the reminder that there are many cases and many issues around this type of racism that need to be addressed, but also the fact that there is still a challenge, because if this movement had not come out of the US, it would not have been picked up in other places. We've heard that the movement is strong in India for the Dalit community, in the Pacific for West Papua, but it was only when this type of protest and these hashtags started to come out that that connection was made. So it's important to recognize the significance of that. Of course, this also ties into the issues of you know, colonialism, as has been mentioned by others, and the racism that perpetuates in our region. But I'll leave that for a later part of today's Talanoa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend James. And actually, I want to continue with you and asking, I mean, with your long involvement with the ecumenical movement, we have seen so many mechanisms, policies, programs, statements, gestures by the church in addressing racism. The church has also in certain areas apologized, but have these really been enough? I mean, you've spoken about civil society movements, but what about the church? Have they really done enough about this?
Well, I would say that I'm very grateful to the fact that there are 2 sessions of this series of webinars, which means we have kind of decolonized that process. Fernando and a few others from the World Council of Churches in their Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace meeting last week. I was only able to join them for a few hours because it was taking place at 1 o'clock in the morning Fiji time. And in the context of this current pandemic around Zoom, there is actually very little, often very little consideration being made to people from other parts of the world. So Europe continues to be the center, America continues to be the center, and everybody else just has to fit in. But coming back to your question, I think this is a very important issue. Recognizing the role that the church plays in society. And this is where we start to see how strong influence the church has in a particular society. You can have a lot of members, but whether or not you're actually able to be part of that social transformation is really the evidence is in something like this. We've seen that, in the context here in the Pacific, we still continue to struggle with the West Papuan movement to get people to understand. I observed last year that the Black Lives Matter movement had a very big following. And I have to kept asking the people, what about West Papua? I guess it depends on how you see the impact of colonialism. I think Reverend Tara Tautari spoke quite clearly on that in the Pacific, where in some cases it's seen as bringing civilization, bringing the light, and to a certain extent that narrative has been accepted. But we still have situations here in the Pacific. The country that I'm in and I come from, Fiji, has its own issues of structural racism as a result of colonialism, as a result of the colonization of mission, which began with quite a liberative or liberational aspect, but very quickly was colonized. And so we see that in 1987, the church that I belong to was quite strong in the first military coup, quite strong in its racist sentiments against people of Indian origin. Again, in 2000, we struggled with that, and the journey of changing that culture is a long one and requires a lot of time and attention. And I think that's the thing. We can't just deal with it in the Pacific, as you know, we are very big on ritual and symbolism, but sometimes that becomes can be abused and be turned into rhetoric rather than real meaningful change, systematic or systemic change. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend James. I mean, particularly for highlighting within the ecumenical movement how the politics of time zone, the politics of language actually serve to marginalize certain sections of this planet on the one hand, and the second, which agendas, which issues get on the agenda and which do not, are also a matter of politics. I want to move now to Dr. Lesmore. And Dr. Lesmore, what's your experience with the All Africa Council of Churches? Do you think that the church has done enough?
Thank you, Philip, for such an interesting question. I would say that in terms of being proactive, as churches, particularly, let's say at the continental level in Africa, you can say there are selective actions that were taken from different countries in Africa against all forms of racism, and particularly we are looking at xenophobic attack. And quite recently, and of course, when there was a xenophobic attack in South Africa, at AACC, we were able to liaise and reach out to our counterpart, the South African Council of Churches. We have issued statement condemning such xenophobic attack, which of course can be linked to racism in a way. And I mean, lots of statements have been issued. Policies probably have been promulgated. But the question is, these statements, these policies, mechanisms, have they been transformed into programs or actions that have brought about the desired change in perception of the one who looks and believes differently from me? Now, there was a time, or once upon a time, WCC had a program to combat racism. What happened? Yes, it contributed in confronting the apartheid regime. But after that, what happened? It is no longer there. So it raises the question of how then do we transform or translate the statements that are issued at conferences, at consultations, at summits into concrete action to combat such vices, such toxic systems and structures that continue to undermine the dignity of the human person. So we have continued to say, okay, how then do we get even these issues brought to our altars or pulpits, where it is deeply rooted even in our own liturgies? I mean, you would find that there are texts that are used in the scriptures, probably during sermons, but the interpretation completely is far away from the contextual realities of the people. So it raises the question of how then do we ensure that this statement, well written, how can they be translated into operational mechanisms that will bring in this desired change that confront the forces of racism or xenophobic attack, where you literally or arbitrarily attack someone just because he believes differently from you or he looks differently from you. So it is not just about the statement, the policies that are there. They are fantastic, they can be there, but how do we operationalize them is the major question that we need to wrestle with and get the churches to say, far from just written statements and policies, how do we turn them into mechanisms for transformation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to actually, you left us with the question, how do we translate these statements into action? And I'm going to really direct this question to Dr. Enns. Now, Dr. Enns, you have had a long history of involvement with the World Council of Churches, with the ecumenical movement, right through programs to combat racism and all of that. And we have produced these brilliant, moving calls for actions and statements in our statements, but how do we actually begin to operationalize them?
Yeah, thank you. It's very important to bring that up. I think, let me take you back to the 8th Assembly of the World Council of Churches. It was in Harare, Zimbabwe. And then President of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, was speaking to us. And he made this comment, which made us all so proud when we heard him saying that without the support and the help of the World Council of Churches, it wouldn't have been possible to overthrow the apartheid regime. That, I must say, has stayed in our heads, at least for some of us. And so I'm choosing this example to explain that we have created a kind of a legacy about our own ecumenical institutions and churches, that we are on the right side, we are on the good side, we are the people, you know, who have always fought against racism, apartheid, you name it. You know, we are the justice and peace people. That is, I'm speaking here for myself, but maybe this is also true for others. This has led to a blindness of continuing racism within our own ranks and within our own churches, within our own ecumenical institutions, I must say. So today, I'm more than ever convinced that we need to decolonize the World Council of Churches. We need to decolonize and start to do that our own churches. And I'm speaking for my own church, the Mennonite Church in Germany, in the Netherlands. We need to decolonize and deconstruct that theology. it is not enough to look back and celebrate some of the achievements that the World Council of Churches has been part of, and it is a great legacy, and I want to refer back to that. Yet, if it leads to something like, okay, racism, that's done for us, then it is creating this blindness, and I think this is the high risk that we also see in the churches in Western Europe. I must say, there is this self-perception that you know, we are not racist. I mean, we are the ones who are fighting against it. And whereas, in fact, I mean, Lesmore has just pointed to the fact: what about xenophobia? What about Islamophobia in our own ranks and in our own churches? What about anti-Judaism that continues? And it is interesting to see at this moment in our societies that there is a movement, even from, you know, churches, people of goodwill, moving to a direction that says we have to start to defend our democracies, we have to start to defend our tolerance, our open and free societies, and so on, which implies that we are under attack from some of these foreigners, some of these other people. And now we're talking about othering the other, and that is a colonial mindset. That is a colonial, it has always been like that. You know, we create our image of the other, and the other wants to attack our way of living. They want to attack our values and so on, and we start to protect that, and we have to be more clear about that. These kinds of movements, I mean, there's a hidden racism here that we need to address. James has pointed to a simple fact. You know, it's, you know, when we organize our Zoom conferences, is that who is choosing for the time? When do we meet? Are we going to say, oh, we are so sorry, James, but again, you have to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, because most of us, you know, we're sitting in other time zones, and of course we will not do it. I mean, it's these little things. Allow me one more thought here, and this has to do with the current program of the World Council of Churches, and you pointed to that, the pilgrimage of justice and peace. It was not for nothing that we call it a pilgrimage of justice and peace. It is not a pilgrimage for justice and peace. We are moving away from this attitude of we are the good ones and we are going to tell the world and preach to the world how to do it. No, it is a pilgrimage of justice and peace. And it was a brother from Africa who pointed to this fact in the very beginning, who said, if it is not a pilgrimage of justice and peace, if we are not the people of justice and of peace, why do we believe that we can preach to the world, and why do we think that we have it all right already and fixed it, and now all we have to do is to do some mission in the world? No, it starts with us. And if we cannot be a community of justice, and I think, I mean, we are still far away from that in the World Council of Churches, but also in our churches, then we have no right to speak with that attitude, you know, we are going to save the world. It is only if we put our feet ourselves on a road of justice and peace that we might be transformed ourselves. I'm picking up on this question of transformation. It is only by us allowing to be transformed that we will probably be able to participate in a larger transformation in our societies.
Thank you, Dr. Enns. Actually, what you have said also very much resonates with the question that has come up in the chat box about the church's own complicity in perpetuating racism even among the different minority groups that exist within our churches. And how do we deal with the question of whiteness? Now we'll come back to that in our question and answer session, but I just wanted to tag it. But I would like to move to Ms. Priyanka now. Now, Ms. Priyanka, it's very evident that the three other people in this conversation are firmly located within the ecumenical movement and the church, right? This is their location, this is their space. You come to us as civil rights activists from a slightly, well, we hope it's a connected space, but a different space here. I want you to be very direct and tell us, what do you expect from the church?
Thank you. I honestly think that the church hasn't done enough. I believe that inequality is political, structural, and historic. Therefore, our approach within churches to achieve equity must also be political. We very clearly need to understand the political economy of exclusion and reform to be able to bring about transformation changes within our societies and churches. I honestly think that in our churches, we need to ensure that we adhere to the highest human rights and other key normative standards to protect and safeguard the rights of all, particularly those who have been historically marginalized, like the Blacks, the Dalits, among others. And in order to achieve this equity, we need to push our churches to adopt policies that target improvements for marginalized communities and sort of just move beyond service provision to focusing on changing hegemonic colonial norms and discourse through progressive policies and bringing about, progressive structural changes even within the ecumenical movement. So I really believe that within our churches, there is a need to widen the concept and understanding of social justice. And in the definition of development itself, we really need to adopt a lens of intersectionality, because no one comes with one single identity. There are multiple accesses of oppression, and that needs to be factored in. And when we adopt an intersectional approach, particularly while forming policies and strategies within our churches, we would be able to address structural gaps and pay the path to substantive equality. It's not just equality for you and me, but substantive equality for the historically marginalized. And in that, there will be distributive justice. And I think within our churches, it's high time that we pay the path for people from vulnerable communities, and we give them a seat at all decision-making tables. I think that is a critical area. They need to be there. Their voices need to be heard. They need to be the ones who are developing policies. And this is true both within the church and society at large, including governments. I think this process would sort of open up open up avenues which will drive efforts to an intersectional and inclusive future.
Thank you very much. Ms. Priyanka, there is a question actually that is arising in the chat box that I would like you to address, because I think you've already begun to explore some of this. And this question by Ms. Jessica Richard says, while speaking of models of anti-racist action, there is a danger of homogenizing the oppressed community. And in doing this, it polarizes one particular challenge of that group. And therefore, it leads to a certain hierarchicalization of oppressions in a certain way. And we lose out in the process of perhaps feminist intersectionality, which would bring up the issues of the queer community, gender issues faced by women, people living with disabilities, and these other, many other myriad forms of oppression. What would you say would be possible models that we could identify as church and civil society to be able to address this question of intersectionality?
There's no one size fits all approach. I think this brings me back to my question on representation. Representation from diverse communities, including sexual minorities and historically marginalized groups, should really be a non-negotiable. In whatever spaces that we occupy, when we give them a seat at the table, the discourse changes. There's this very famous African saying which says that if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And I think we marginalized groups are sick and tired of being on the menu. We're really looking for a seat at the table in order for our perspectives and priorities to be mainstreamed in the policies that get designed within churches, within governments, and the larger civil society. This will really lead to marginalized voices leading, shaping, and influencing policies across the spectrum. Churches are sort of an integral part of community and have always been at the forefront of responding to crisis, right? So churches really are well placed within communities to build trust, to counter fear, and to build, all sorts of resilience, be it mental resilience, spiritual resilience. So they really do have, in terms of social location, they're very well placed to sort of change the discourse. So in our pursuit to leave no one behind, I think it's critical to sort of prioritize planning and implementation of our outreach programs through the lens of intersectionality. And talking about intersectionality, there is no one model that would sort of fit fit every space, especially our churches. The only way to go about it is to identify people who ought to be at the table, and for them to design what sort of policies they want to sort of take forward.
Thank you so much, Ms. Priyanka. Reverend James, you describe yourself as someone who is interested and has worked with these many levels of intersectionality. What would you say about this question? Ms. Priyanka has said it's very difficult to make a one-size-fit-all kind of model, but what possibilities do you think are there for the church to follow or highlight in making sure that intersectionality actually happens?
I think if you want to, and this is the challenge I find, if you want to do something that goes deep, if you want to address a deep-rooted change, that takes time. And often we do not honor the situation with enough time. Usually, and this is a situation when a group have realized that they have wronged, or there is this movement begins, there is such a rush to respond to it. And again, this goes back to a form of a colonialism, where we say, okay, we would like to engage on this issue, but can you get back to us in 2 days, or get back to us in a week? And there is very little time for consultation. Now, this is important because what happens is, in the rush to respond, people are left out. And that's when when you try to be intersectional, that's when you fail. You're not bringing everybody on board. And you have to ensure that that space is safe enough for people to engage. That's the biggest challenge, I think, for us, that in places where the church, even in, and I really like the question, because it talks about the challenges of homogenizing oppressed groups. So even within groups that are oppressed, there is another form of patriarchy, or another form of oppression that takes place, about who enters that space to speak and be consulted and shares. And so that becomes for me, the biggest challenge about how do you be inclusive and representative, but also respond so that the moment is not lost. And I think that becomes a challenge where often we choose on the side of time rather than being inclusive in our engagement.
Thank you, Reverend James, and thank you for highlighting this question of what I would call cowboy ecumenism. I mean, trying to shoot from the hip as soon as possible without taking the time really to consult, to discern. We move now to the next question, which really raises how the church, and it's a related question, of course, how is the church involved itself in contributing to the violence and hostility against Black, Brown, and Indigenous folk? We can't as a church, say that we are not racist? Although that seems to be the mantra of everyone. You know, our favorite or non-favorite president most famously said, "I'm the least racist person in this room." Uh, Everyone wants to claim to be non-racist, even though they may be the most racist. And there is inherent in this, "I am not racist," a built-in white supremacy and whiteness which needs to be addressed, that arises, as the person asking the question says, from a theology that is predominantly Eurocentric. So I'm going to ask Dr. Les Moray, to begin answering this question, and then move to Dr. Enns to also offer an answer to this.
We are faced with the question or the challenge of hypocrisy. And until we are able to address the culture of hypocrisy, we would always have this challenge with us. So that we are able to say as a church that we are guilty, not on the basis that someone imposes that notion of being guilty, but that it is coming from a genuine willing heart that recognizes that there is need for metanoia, that I have sinned, I am guilty. Of course, like you said, it is a deep-rooted ideology that informs our perception of the other and how we deal with such structures and systems that continues to undermine the fullness of life. So it comes with this audacious courage to say that, look, we are called into being, into oneness, recognizing our diversity as a church, that we are not one and the same in expression, in our outlook, but that we recognized our diversity and that each one embodies a gift that brings to the table so that no one is left out. Now, it raises the question that when we say the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," it raises the question, what is this will of God that is in heaven that needs to be manifested here on earth? We have shied away, probably in our responses to the question of what is that will of God that needs to be made manifest on earth. We respond to such question from our own selfish and hypocritical point of view, because we want to satisfy our need. And that was why I asked earlier, have we encountered one individual that will openly come and say, yes, I am a racist, but I have repented. I was once blind, but now I can see. I am so sorry. And it came from a willing heart, not by compulsion. And of course, that is why it is also connected to the earlier question that was asked, that some churches have apologized. Has it made any effect? In those contexts where some churches have apologized for being accomplished or complicit with regards to issues of colonialism and all forms of racism and white supremacy. Is it genuine? Is it authentic? What fruits have such yielded to? So we need to address the question of hypocrisy and embrace audacious courage to ask the right question and from a willing heart, confess genuinely not because we want to bring cosmetic into this conversation, but rather to be honest, to be authentic, to be genuine in our confession, because it is coming from an open and willing heart. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Enns.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for all these very important reflections. I feel that I'm learning a lot. I would like to make a comment first about something that Ms. Priyanka said earlier about, creating space at the table. I'm becoming more and more radical, I think, in this regard. Because, well, you all are familiar with the famous article and the quotation from Spivak, who says, "Can the subaltern speak?" That, for me, that has been an eye-opener, I must say, because it is after studying Spivak and other post-colonial scholars, I must say that I realize it is not anymore about, can we make space at the table? Who is this we? Who is asking this question? Can we, white people, or can we church leaders, can we scholars, can we Europeans, North Americans, can make some space for someone else which has been neglected? Well, we've done that through the past decades, I must say. And we have, and every time now and then we have realized, okay, there's another group. Oh yeah, there's some Dalits. Yeah, let's make some space for them at the table. But we define how that table is shaped. We still define who is invited and for whom we make space. And I realize more and more, that people, movements, they are not interested in such a table. They are not waiting for us to make space. They are saying, we've had it with your tables. We want to sit on a mat in Fiji. We want to sit under a tree somewhere in the African continent. We want to, we sit on our land as campesinos in Colombia. We are not interested in your tables, and we are not waiting for you. So this is this question: can the subaltern speak? Does not mean can that person or really speak? It is the question that is raised: is there an infrastructure possible that those voices that are usually not heard, that we can create such an infrastructure that these voices are being heard? Because and we are just about to start to learn that if we, as you said, Ms. Priyanka, if we do not allow these people to take the lead, I mean, this planet is really going into something that we cannot even control anymore. This is really getting out of hand. So this is also an experience now, a learning experience from the pilgrimage of justice and peace, I must say. We have chosen a methodology that is different. We're not meeting at conference halls first and hotel rooms and, with a nice air condition and good food and so on. First thing we do when we go to a place, we visit local communities with the reference group that we have called together. Because we have discovered, if we do not, as Reverend James was saying, if we do not take time first to sit down with local communities, local movements, communities on the ground, and make time for them in their space and allowing them to create a space for us to host us, then we will continue to write nice declarations and come out with nice papers, and maybe some scholars like me will write another fine book, and we will be praised for that. Nothing changes, nothing. And that is, we're fooling ourselves. This is to the benefit of some white people like me. We have run this business for centuries, so we know how to do it. And it's simply a continuation. So what we really need to do is creating new spaces, and there are new spaces. But the question is, can we as leaders, can we as white people, can we as privileged people, then allow ourselves to be questioned in our whiteness, this is new for many of us, that it's not, oh, let's talk about racism. Yeah, this is about Black people, maybe some Indian brown people. No, racism is about white people. It is about your whiteness. And if I mean, I'm not saying that sentence anymore. I thought for a long time, I'm not a racist. I'm a Christian. I was raised in a wonderful Mennonite family community. Peace Church. Everything great. We have it right. No one, and also growing up partly in Brazil, it was always very trying to be inclusive and so on. But no one in all my life, and I'm over 50 years old now, in all my theological training, no one ever asked the question, are you aware of the fact that you are a white person? And isn't that interesting? Is that it has never occurred to any of my teachers, any of my mentors, that this, Fernando, you have to consider that, because that is shaping you. That is your socialization. This has influenced your life. It is part of your identity. Did you ever reflect on that? No, I haven't. I didn't have to. Unless we start to do that, I think people like me, let's say, unless we start to do that, we're not even talking about systemic racism here, because we don't even know what that thing is.
Thank you, Dr. Enns. We have several more questions. Coming up in the chat box, and we will take them in our second round of questioning. But I would like to move forward and ask Ms. Priyanka at the moment, in your work, in your anti-caste work that you're doing in this particular case, and please, we really want to hear this. Where are you finding the pushback and resistance?
Yeah. I think the most resistance I witness in my work on caste-based discrimination is the increasing backlash on Dalits when they try to access justice, especially Dalit women when they try to access justice. And I think this is true of the Black community as well. There is, this pattern, if we see across the globe, an increasing weaponization of their access to justice as well. So what is really appalling is, the systemic sanction to violate Dalit people's, Black people's dignity and rights, and the social capital and network of impunity that, in our case, people from dominant castes, and in the context of Blacks, you see how white supremacists leverage their social capital to sort of maintain their impunity is really, really alarming. Although we marginalized women, especially Dalit women, respect and believe in due processes, right? The state and church also, I would say, has largely failed to protect our rights and dignity. As the saying goes, justice delayed is justice denied. It's sort of, we see that play out on an everyday basis. For instance, the continuance of caste attitude towards the Dalits has not drawn the same amount of solidarity and attention as the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're over 300 million people worldwide, but still our voices don't matter. And I think the roadblocks lie in equitable access to justice, in terms of both preventive measures as well as restorative justice. I think that both of these aspects are very crucial to address the root causes underlying structural conditions. And of course, the apathy of the state, the apathy of society at large really enables this sort of targeted violence against both Dalits and Black people. And also an interesting point is, even our data points to the fact that conviction rates are so low when it comes to the Dalits and Black community. And this sort of reflects both caste and race prejudice in law enforcement agencies, in the judiciaries, in every possible institution that there is. So therefore, I think that, you know, redistributive justice needs to be center staged and adhered to while designing inclusive policies, both within the church and, you know, governments. And, you know, just to sort of answer Dr. Enns, I think, Reverend Enns, I think what he said is absolutely true. I couldn't agree more. But, you know, when it comes to the tables that I'm talking about are also loaded with resources that people from historically marginalized communities don't have access to. And I'm particularly talking about redistribution of resources as a part of redistribution of justice, because without resources, both financial and technical resources, there's very little that we can achieve. And I say this out of experience, you know, we don't necessarily need to be on your tables, but we definitely need resources. So that's the point that I would like to reiterate. And, you know, within our churches as well, we usually come across voices of certain privileged groups over others. And, you know, it sort of fails to articulate the perspectives of women, people across the LGBTQI spectrum, Dalits, indigenous groups, Blacks. You know, our lived realities remain constricted from the dominant ecumenical framework as well. And, you know, we could be having our own tables on the peripheries, but I think it's also really important for our voices to be mainstream, and therefore we need a seat at your tables as well. So moving forward, we really should shift our strategies from, you know, a single access understanding of oppression and adopt intersectional approaches and, you know, take cognizance of what these groups have to say, not just as victims, but also agents of change within our churches and society at large. That's it from me.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. I think that brought a really, really important part to the discussion, that marginalized communities may have our own tables, but we need to be at those tables in which the resources that have been taken from us really are. I want to now move to Dr. Enns. But Dr. Enns, while you speak about the pushback that perhaps you have even personally faced in your anti-racism work, there is a question in the chat box that asks very directly, and perhaps this is a question we should have started off on the first day with. What is the difference between being not racist and anti-racist? So if you could start by answering that question, then move to telling us what is your experience of pushback?
Thank you. Please allow me, Dr. Peacock, quickly to respond to Ms. Priyanka one more time about the tables.
Of course, yes.
This is thank you for that. It clarifies a lot, and I think I understand exactly what you're pointing to, and I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's about the resources, and it's about as long as the decisions are made at some tables. I mean, it's yeah, we cannot just say like, okay, you know, you create your own tables. To take that thought one step further, I mean, this tells me that yes, we have to reshape all the tables, or let's say the mats, or the trees under which we meet, or whatever. What I want, or what I'm dreaming of, is that, you know, that we shape these spaces together. It's not that one you know, ask these white people to become more inclusive. I mean, what is that? That is still the one-sided perspective. It is we need to create these new and other spaces, and it is not that you have to reinvent the wheel. There are so many great inclusive spaces around this globe, and they're happening, but it's usually not where the powerful are sitting, because the powerful have no interest in, you know, sharing that power. That's the thing. What is the difference between how did you phrase it, Philip?
What is the difference between non-racist and anti-racist?
Yeah.
I am not a racist on the one hand, or I'm anti-racist on the other.
Well, I would say that is moving into the action or orientation. What we saw Dr. Lesmore also speaking about and pondering on. It's I'm not a racist. I mean, that allow me to say that's one of the most stupid sentences I've ever heard, and yet it is a very common sentence in my part of the world, or where I live. Everyone in the church that I'm attending would say I'm not a racist, and everyone in the universities that I'm teaching, of course, I'm not a racist. And yet, I mean, it is that is stupid, because we are all caught up in this systemic racism that we talked about earlier. Now, one step is to acknowledge that and to accept the fact that it's not, it's not about you making a great confession here about your guilt about being a racist. It is about, do you see that? Can you analyze that? Can you accept the fact that you have been raised, you have been socialized, you are part of a system that is racist in itself? And that is step number one. Now the next step then to go anti-racism, to become anti-racism, that is yet another step, I would say, which is maybe the hardest thing to do. I mean, this has been called white fragility, all the defense mechanisms that start right here. So we have great scholars like Fernando Enz who think they have accepted that, and they see that they are part of a racist system in general, globally, and colonialism is not over. I mean, it continues. We see it is so clever that it finds every time it finds new ways to do it. It is just new labels, but in fact, it continues. So acknowledge that is one thing, but then all the defense mechanisms are starting with white people, and we're good at that. I mean, don't underestimate that. This white fragility is what Robin DiAngelo has brought into the discussion as a terminology, is that you are going to defend yourself, and with the best arguments ever, and with the best terminology, and it comes across as work for justice and peace, and work for tolerance, and work for freedom and democracy and all that. That is very powerful. We have to understand that people like me in privileged situations, we have power over words, and we can use also intelligence and scholarships and universities, think tanks, influencing them in a way that it looks to ourselves. It looks like we are against racism, and yet this is not anti-racism yet. Anti-racism only starts if it starts to change the realities of people, period. This is not going to be changed, and the criterion cannot be like, oh, can we make that statement as a church, and can we bring this politician to make that public move or whatever. It only is anti-racist work if it changes a person's life. And that is, I would hold on to that, and hold ourselves also to that. Otherwise, we keep on fooling ourselves. And as I said, we are the experts in doing that.
Thank you. Very quick responses from Dr. Lesmore and Reverend James on where do you find the pushback in your anti-racist work?
I would honestly lean to the comment, the last part of the comment that was made by Dr. Ains. If whatever that we do, whether statements that are issued, whether solidarity messages that are sent out, or actions, but if they do not transform these structures to become just structures and systems that bring the convergence of all, without anyone left out, regardless of who the individual is. Pushbacks can, from our own end, we have seen how even the scriptures are used to perpetuate such things. Such unjust systems and structures and messages, the scriptures become safe spaces. Religious texts are used to perpetuate that. We have seen that even with apartheid. And we are seeing it even today, even in terms of exclusion of certain population in our conversation, in our fellowship, in our movement as a church. We have seen even some congregations, in Africa, where women are not even allowed to step to the altar because the scripture says, let the women be silent in the church. So most of the pushbacks we experience around here is where we see religious texts, religious instructions, religious things are being used to sustain such kinds of exclusion, marginalization, discrimination of all sorts. So these are often being used by so-called men of God. So we are confronted with this challenge of saying, how then can scripture be read transformatively? How can texts, religious texts, be used in such an empowering manner so as to resist all forms of unjust structures and forces that perpetuate all kinds of discrimination and exclusion of the other, because the other looks differently and believes differently? We are faced, of course, with religious plurality here, where, of course, as a Christian, you will say, no, I do not want to have anything to do with my Muslim brother or sister. Or possibly the perception of peace is different from the Christian point of view to the Islamic point of view. So how do we bring this, the convergence of all these perceptions, that they would be life-giving and life-affirming? So that's our major challenge from this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Reverend James?
Who's willing to dismantle the system to which they belong to? This is the challenge, because that's what we're calling ultimately what needs to be done. Excuse me. And that is the biggest challenge, that many of us, particularly as church, have ingrained systems, especially as a result of colonialism, neo-colonialism, development agendas that continue, this thinking in a very insidious way. And I think that really is one of the challenges. The other is, it's about narratives. Whose story? Who tells that story? Who is willing to listen to the story? And who keeps the story alive? One of the challenges I see in this day and age is our narrow perception of history. How many millennials know about the 20th century or even the 19th and going back? And this is the challenge for us when we live in this hyper-realized situation. And so that becomes a challenge for us. When the other is when the pushback comes in the context of when people feel that they have not done anything wrong. And that question of, I'm not racist, but it was the other guys, but I have inherited the system. That's why I ask, who is willing to dismantle the system? In Fiji, for example, we have the case of, as the mission was colonized, because the mission there are arguments that there were liberative elements in some of the mission in Fiji, but as it was colonized, this whole perception on the natives, the indigenous people, recent converts, former cannibals, not worthy of equal status as ministers of the word, so they couldn't sit in the same meetings. And then that was transferred to the way in which the indigenous people then looked at the migrant communities. And what happens when we have a situation where a church is ethnically, or when you have a country where it's ethnically, and the ethnic and religious majority are looking in another way to migrant communities. So the challenge that we face in that, and I think we're facing that in a regional way also in the Pacific as we try to decolonize the way in which the Pacific has been set up almost. Many of you, if you know the sub-regions of the Pacific, will be Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia. The Polynesians are the fair-skinned, big, strong, articulate people of many islands, the voyagers of the Pacific. The Melanesians, the blackness of the Pacific. The Micronesians, the smallness of the Pacific. And for generations, this has been passed on, not just from a colonial perspective, to where we ourselves have embraced it. And so when we have regional crises, we get shocked when we realize that we have to look at our own, this racism that has come in a very insidious way. So the only way really is to dismantle the system. And it comes to power. Who is willing to give up their power to dismantle the system so that everyone can share that power equally?
Thank you so much, Reverend James. We have 9 minutes left in this webinar. And Reverend Bhagwan has raised a very important question. How do we dismantle systems that we are part of? I'm going to ask the 3 remaining panelists to very quickly answer this particular question. We'll start with Dr. Lesmore.
Dismantling such systems and structures requires courage. Courage on our part to affirm that we are complicit of such oppressive, life-denying systems and structures and come to true repentance, metanoia. And until we are able to recognize that we are willing to give up the privileges and benefits that we gain from such unjust structures within the ecclesia community, then otherwise, such unjust systems and structures will continue to perpetuate, and we will be part of those who are guilty of conspiracy of silence because we benefit from it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Enns.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think this is the key question, James. Thank you for saying that. Dismantling. One of the things that I want to point to is like, how do we teach? I mean, since I'm teaching at the university, teaching theology and ethics, what I have done, but also others, is in Western Europe and in predominantly white universities, change the curriculum. Start to dismantle some of the legacies and some of the things that we have taken for granted, Let me give you an example. We're so proud when we do ethics, you know, we do it with Immanuel Kant. And I mean, this is the Enlightenment. And this is when, you know, this is the start of human rights. Everything that we do in human rights today is based on that brain, you know, the individual is so important and so on. Well, did you know that Immanuel Kant made some very racist remarks and that he was a racist person? I mean, wow, that is, if you bring that into some of the debates that we are having and you write about it and you tell your students about that and your colleagues, this is usually, it works like a wake-up call. It's like, what? No, you must be wrong, Fernando. That cannot be true. And so on. No, and you know, I have proof, you know, you go back to the resources. So that is one thing. I think education is one way of and really, I mean, allowing also what James said earlier, always asking the question, whose narrative, you know, whose story is told? And more we discover that there are stories, you know. It is not true that it was, oh, you know, all these other cultures, they only had oral stories and, you know, we have the written stories. So, you know, that's powerful. No, that is not true. And so on. I think this decolonization of not only our theologies, not only our ethics, and that includes, you know, being dismissing some of the saints that we have celebrated in the past, simply saying we sorry guys, but you're not helpful anymore. We cannot. I will some of the books that are the classics, called the classics, I will not ask my students to read anymore. In fact, I will warn them. Or if I ask them to read them, I will say like, okay, let's look at that together. Let's analyze. So this is something, but it is much broader. This is just a very little piece. That in the churches, I mean, the way we preach, the way we relate, and so on. But I don't want to take more time. I'm sorry. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Enns. And Ms. Priyanka.
Yeah, so very quickly, I think this would involve a continuous commitment to keep vigilant about and challenge the reproduction of colonial, casteist, racist, patriarchal practices and behaviors within our own churches that sort of deter collaboration, proactive listening, and that benefit a few at the expense of others, right? So I would say colonial, racist, and racial and caste privilege will continue to persist unless everyone examines the way they feed into these structures of white supremacy or caste dominance and supremacy in small and large ways through our everyday actions. So I think, you know, we should start with ourselves, and that will reflect in all the institutions that we are a part of, including our churches.
Thank you so much. And by some miracle, we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask the Reverend James Bhagwan in 2 of these 3 minutes to say a little more about decolonized ecumenism.
And you've just colonized me by giving me only 2 minutes. In the Pacific Way, we take 2 hours.
I'm sorry.
No, I think what as someone, and although we weren't able to host as many visits by the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace last year when the focus of the WCC PJP was in the Pacific, I think what Fernando has said and shared regarding the PJP, listening to other communities, engaging and sitting with us is very, very important. That's where it starts from. And how we continue to bring that spirit as the WCC moves to its assembly next year will be very, very important to see whether the assembly next year itself is a pilgrimage of justice and peace. With a very important theme of Christ's love moves us to reconciliation and unity. I think that is going to be really how the assembly is delivered will be a key to understanding where ecumenism is going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually, with what you said, we turn back once more to Spivak. who talks about this deep listening, and a deep listening that actually discombobulates us, that moves us out of shape, that actually we have a learning from those communities that we set out to save. And perhaps this will lead to the dismantling of our structures and the decolonizing of our ecumenical movement. Thank you to each one of you panelists, to Reverend James Bhagwan, to Ms. Priyanka, to Dr. Enns, and to Dr. Lesmore for joining us. I remind you that after the session closes, we will be meeting for a short debrief in a separate link that the Dr. Preeta Crutchley has sent to us. For everyone else who's attended this meeting, thank you very much for your presence, your patience. We've had a lot of questions in the chat box, but unfortunately not been able to answer all of them. Perhaps some will be taken up again tomorrow. I remind you once more, the same questions will be looked at by a different set of panelists at 3:30 p.m. Central European Summertime this evening. And secondly, we will be meeting again tomorrow at the same time, followed by another session tomorrow evening. Thank you and goodbye.